Okay, try. Good morning. Would you mind turning off your phones? Thanks. Well, I hope you're not too bruised after yesterday. Today's story is a good message. It has a sad ending, but it's rather a wonderful message that we're doing today. And we're going to the Roman Baroque, and we are going to look at Caravaggio. Now, could you all please tell me if this is a lot better? And clear, and not fluffy. Yeah? Okay, good, that's wonderful. Are we all okay? Ready to roll? So far, you've been excellent. Although I'm shaken, because one of my audience apparently said that somebody should have had a rifle and shot me on the carpet yesterday. I said, you know, you don't shoot the messenger. Okay. Well, Caravaggio. One of those artists that we all want to know more about, but a little bit frightened of. He's so powerful, he's so strong. And he was a wild boy. I mean, he's the bad boy of art. He's the boy that gets into scraps. He throws plates of artichokes around. In Rome, that's a pity. They're very nice, aren't they? Carciofi, what are they called? Carciofi, yes, exactly. And getting into fights and everything else. I think, can I turn the sound down a tiny bit, Mpo? Which one is it? Is that okay? Okay. I'm not sure which way you're so it really all goes back to his background. He was born near Milan, but not in Milan, and brought up in Milan. And unfortunately, his early childhood coincided with one of the worst outbreaks of plague. You will know that the plague ravaged Europe over and over again. Well, this particular bout of plague was intense, and as a child he saw these wooden carts going past the window, piled high with bodies. Tragedy was when all the men in his family died in one night. At the age of 4, he woke up and found that he'd lost his father, his uncle, and his brother. Well, that was quite enough to put him right on the wrong foot for life. He goes down to Rome, where he's immediately embroiled in all the richness of the Vatican court, and he takes on, or he becomes part of the circle of Francesco Maria del Monte, a cardinal who had quite a big circle of friends, including a lot of young men. And he gets a reputation for being a very bad loser at tennis, particularly. He would simply jump over the net and attack. This is going to, I'm afraid, stand him in very bad stead when we get more towards the end of the story. You can see his portrait here. He's lifting up a light. And it was only this morning at 5 o'clock when I looked at this again. I thought, what a wonderful, wonderful starting image, because he is searching for the light. And this is what we're going to find in the painting that we're going to look at today. So he becomes a complete expert in painting flower paintings and bowls of fruit and young men, particularly rather attractive young men. In this particular slide, what you can see on the left here is a very tiny portrait of himself that he put into the carafe of wine. Now, he's 25 years old, and most 25-year-olds will know perfectly well what that means. But he shows himself as with dark curly hair, painting and holding a paintbrush and working at an easel. Now, I can't see this, and neither can you, but the experts who've looked at this, that's what they've found. So he's identifying himself as a bit of a wild boy. Let's see. This portrait was made a while after his death. I don't really like it, but seeing this is the only one, I'm just giving it to you to have a quick look at. Hello, Terrell. Is that Terrell? No? So I can't see. So here he is. He developed a tremendous reputation, of course, as a fantastic painter, who people were frightened of. And he died there on July the 18th, 1610. In Rome, he'd got a lot of commissions to do very big and important paintings, and he soon became very well known. And this is the painting that we're going to look at. It's called The Supper at Emmaus, and it is a masterpiece of Roman Baroque painting. It's also perhaps one of the most important paintings in the National Gallery, well, in the whole of the United Kingdom, probably. And it shows us a figure not identified with a gold halo, a figure at a table, looking down at a bowl of fruit, raising his hands over some bread, with 3 people around him, 2 people who recognize him and 1 person who doesn't. Okay? It's very important that the composition is so asymmetrical. We talked about the Renaissance as being defined by symmetry, geometry, and balance. That's what we've lost now as we move into the Baroque. This painting is entirely asymmetrical and almost unfinished in terms of composition because there is a large gap right here. There's a gap. The composition goes like that, and there's an enormous gap right there. When we look at the painting, we can feel that there really is no escape. It's very hot and physical. We're very close to these people. We can practically smell the smell of the leather jerkin that this traveler is wearing. We can't hear what's going on, but we are right there. And we are put into orbit by the arms that are breaking the picture plane. And yesterday, if you were on your toes, I mentioned the fact that the picture plane was penetrated backwards in the Renaissance, but out into our space in the Baroque, when all of a sudden this space is included in the painting. So the arm of the apostle here, on that side, is reaching out to us, while the other hand reaches behind him. People have made nasty comments about the fact the hand at the back is too big. It's done deliberately so that you see it. Caravaggio is not... I hate it when people criticize great, great geniuses. Well, he did it for a reason, because what is this gesture, everybody? What is that gesture? Exactly, thanks. So that's very important. And then instead of 1 person doing this, you have the 2. So you have a huge, big space which pulls you in like that. Now, we're going to look at this in great depth over the next hour. And lots of things will come out of it. But let's just go on to say that, let's have the history first of all. So it was probably commissioned by a wealthy Roman aristocrat called Ciriaco Mattei, and he died in 1614. So he was, I don't know how old he was, and he was the brother of the person in whose household Caravaggio was staying. And he also probably commissioned the Taking of Christ in Dublin, which I'll show you later on. The 2 disciples are fleeing Jerusalem, and they meet a stranger on the way. And they later find out who he is. And this story is a story that we find in the book of Luke. Caravaggio actually made, I put in this page because it's wonderful to see a text. You see that there are no commas and no numbers and no sentences. So this is a wonderful page from the good message of Luke. Luke's Gospel, or the Gospel named for Luke, is the longest book in the New Testament, and the sources were Mark and Q, as with the other synoptic Gospels. So they say that about 64% is Mark and Q, and 35% unique to Luke. And this would be then part of the 35%. I think that's rather exciting. So there's another version, the second version, which comes 5 years later, and neither the innkeeper nor the serving women are in the story. I feel this painting doesn't work so well because the innkeeper and the serving woman dominate the painting, and I feel that the Christ figure is kind of crushed in there, I don't know how you feel, but it just doesn't seem to work. And also, you're not invited into the painting. You're no longer part of the plan. I'm just showing you that in case people show you this and say, that's the Supper at Emmaus. And you said, yes, that's right, but that's another version. That's the reason I'm putting it in, okay? That woman, you can see, all these people are real people that he knew around him in Rome. This woman up here is probably the same model as he used for this lovely painting in the Borghese Gallery, where the baby Jesus is stepping on a stake, but only after his mum stepped on it first. And you can see Anna looking down there and saying, oh, isn't he lovely? But that was quite a shocking painting because of the way the Virgin is portrayed, and in red, not in blue. Anyway, let's just go a little bit into Caravaggio's technique, which is important to quite understand. The word tenebrism, people love this word tenebrism. It simply means darkness. And it was a very heightened form of chiaroscuro. The chiaroscuro that was developed by Leonardo yesterday turns into tenebrism, a highly dramatic form of light and dark. And he's usually acutely aware of the realism in his subjects. And this gives them a great emotional intensity, I feel. The people are real people. The light is real light, and they exist in real space. So although he was denounced because he didn't do the proper thing, people were nevertheless frightened of his work. And also, he painted from life without drawings, without preparatory drawings, which were absolutely de rigueur all the way through Renaissance and High Renaissance. And it was rather at odds with the classical idealism that we'd seen with Michaelangelo Buonarroti, with Raphael, and so on, and even with Leonardo. All of that was swept aside as he got down to imagining the holy scenes among real people in Rome, sitting in real inns, drinking real Roman wine, with dirt under their nails, probably shouting and swearing in Italian. And he painted them then with all their natural defects. We're used to this because we are post-realism, but in those days this was really shocking. And then, as I told you, he made no preparatory drawing. So the earlier paintings, just to set the scene, he painted very many of these baskets of fruit and flowers, and they were all, this is called a vanitas, it's a memento mori, a reminder of the shortness of life, a reminder of death, in fact. This beautiful boy holds a basket of fruit, and he catches you with his pitch black eyes, his black curly hair, not a single wisp of grey, and the great shadow looking like dark wings. He almost looks like Baudelaire's Evil Angel, but that would have been mixing up my centuries too much. But you can see that as the fruit will rot, so will the boy's beauty go. And you can also see with the way his dress is falling off his shoulder that it's a seductive painting. And this boy is probably one of his, well, a pupil stroke friend, stroke boyfriend that he had when he was about 25 years old. So these paintings were enormously popular among the cardinals of Rome, and he got very, very good at doing them. This is a famous one, and it's called the Adolescent Bacchus. The Adolescent Bacchus, Caravaggio about 24. Bacchus is half naked, resting on a bed, fiddling with the tie of his robe, which might just fall off the other shoulder too, and swirling his wine in a very seductive way, looking straight out at you, straight out at you. But when you look at the vanitas here, you see that the fruit and that the apples, the pineapples, and the grapes are rotting. So there is a message behind all of this. Nevertheless, these are the paintings that made him really famous. Well, we go on and see a little bit more closely how these baskets of fruit tell about the fall. That the details of the diseases that these fruit happen are real diseases. In fact, one of his works is so accurate that people have written botanical books on plant disease from simply studying this wonderful still life of fruit, that every single fruit has got a distinct bug or minor or whatever it is, which is exactly what that fruit actually has. You can see how he swirls the wine. So we go back to the painting. Now you're drawn into orbit around the sun by this great Baroque composition that comes out and pulls you back, and you're swirling around. And there's the space right in the front there, and that's actually just for you. And you come there because the basket is about to fall off the table, right? And you're walking through the National Gallery and you think, oops, I'll just push it back. The basket is falling off the table. Sorry, this is a bit, can I just do that a bit? And he does it for a reason, because that is the initial, trivial, boring, normal reason why you go to the table is simply to push the basket back. But the basket is much more than that. It really represents the world. And the world is in your lap, and you see the figure of Christ looks at the world and smiles very slightly. I'm sorry. That's the world, and yes, it rots. And you can see him just looking at that basket and saying that, and lifting his hand and saying, but I am the bread of life, over the loaf of bread right here. There we are. Cross in it. As you come to the table, then you complete the painting, okay? Now let's look at some of the details of this basket. There's the basket, and you can see pomegranate, grapes, apples with disease, a fig that's splitting, and you can see here vine leaves. See the vine leaves there? And grapes, you can see that. Now, all of the plants and all of the fruit in here are there, they're there for a reason. And I just thought we'll simply go through them and try and work out really what they're there for. So let's look at the vine leaves. The vine leaves are very simply there to remind of the great I ams. I am the true vine. And this icon here, which is Ukrainian, is simply a visual example of this idea of Christ as the true vine going out like that into the world and having all the fruit that will, of course, turn into the Eucharistic wine. This was a very common theme in the Middle Ages, and what you're looking at here is a mold which was obviously making many copies, so that meant many people had this. And you can see the figure of Christ standing in the wine press here, bending down. There's the screw of the wine press, and will be crushed in the wine press. I have trodden the wine press alone. From the nations no one was with me, from Isaiah 63. The next image is rather nasty, I'm afraid, but I've included it just to show you that this was a widespread iconography, which we don't have anymore. These are some miniatures, and this shows you again the mystic press, as it's called. And you can see in the press that the idea is that Christ is crushed and the blood turns into the wine of the Eucharist. I know it's very vivid and very nasty. It's anonymous as well, and it's French. Well, sorry, I don't mean to make a slur on the French. But the trumpet is, sort of there. So the grapes then have a separate meaning. The grapes obviously allude to the celebration of the Eucharist. And vines and wine and vineyards are actually mentioned nearly 200 times in the whole Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament. I counted them. There are actually 199, but I'm rounding it up to 200 in case I missed one. The point is that vines, the wine, and vineyards are used very much as a metaphor all the way through the Bible. So there are the grapes, but also the vine itself with its tendrils. It represented the caring Christian church in the earliest days. If you see some mosaics, I think, for example, there's a mosaic in San Clemente in Rome in the Alps, which will show the whole background as tendrils of vines, representing the caring Christian church reaching out to the world. This is the background of a marvelous triptych in the Corto collection, the Prince's Gate collection, called the Silent Altarpiece, and I'll show it to you a bit later on, the whole thing. And then we've got the apple. Well, the rotting apple is easy. It alludes to the fall of man and the expulsion. Perhaps the most famous painting on the subject of the fall is Lucas Cranach's painting here, where you have Adam and Eve in the garden, standing by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's not the tree of knowledge, God's got nothing against knowledge as far as I know. Probably invented knowledge. But on the bottom of the tree, up grows a vine with bunches of grapes. And in this painting works in terms of Old Testament and New Testament together. You know, you can see it on both sides. In terms of the Old Testament, the grapes up the front here foretell of Eve's fecundity and the tribes of Israel that will come from this relationship, this marriage. But they also, of course, allude to the Eucharistic wine. But one of the most beautiful parts of this painting, before I leave it, is that you see the lamb is on his own, whereas all the other animals are in pairs. You see the lamb is on his own. And it's particularly important that you see him through a window formed by the antlers of the stag. That is very interesting. The antlers of the stag, which also have 12 tines, of course the sacred number 12, include the figure of Adam and the lamb. It's a very simple piece of iconography. It really says that the lamb redeems the disobedience of Adam on the cross, and the tines represent the crown of thorns. See? Artists had to be very imaginative. Nobody could read. Imagine you'd never seen your name written down. Your parents had never seen their name written down. You couldn't go from one village to another unless you knew it's that tree and that rock and that stone, because you couldn't read any signs. If there was such a thing as a letter, you'd take it to a monk to be read. So all of Christian art is designed to have the maximum knowledge conveyed in the simplest possible visual language. So that's Lucas Cranach the Elder with Adam and Eve, which explains a little bit about the fall. Now the pomegranate, that's a lovely one. The pomegranate is a symbol of the Passion in Christian art. But it's also a very important Jewish symbol, because apparently a pomegranate has 613 seeds and there are 613 laws. My Jewish friend told me that, but I've never counted them. It's an associated also in the Greek world with Persephone, and it's called the fruit of the dead. Persephone, when she was dragged into the underworld by Hades, who you see here on a nice red fig vase, Persephone said she wouldn't eat and she was going to be released, but if she ate, she'd have to stay. And he sneakily gave her one pomegranate seed, so she had to stay. So that's the pomegranate. So you see associated with death. This is just to show you the pomegranate in Christian context. And I was struck by this painting when I looked at it again this morning. First of all, the amazing palette. Where does he get this purple? How did he get... Botticelli's palettes are beyond anything. They're just too wonderful. The baby is holding or taking the pomegranate, but looking directly out at us and waving. And it's an ambiguous gesture. Is it a greeting or is it a farewell? Okay, and then we go back to the whole thing. Now, you're invited to become a pilgrim, and you're invited to become a follower of the way. Can I just ask if Yoli and Spook are here? They're not here. Oh dear, that's very sad. Okay. Okay, anyway, you're invited to become a pilgrim and a follower of the way. How are we going to see that? Well, I want you just to concentrate on this right-hand part of the painting here, just this part. And you're going to find, as you learn about the painting, that every part of it forms a most marvelous sort of still life. Look at that. So looking at this particular detail, you've got a triad: the hand, the shell, and the knot. It's very beautiful, isn't it? Black, white, and brown. Let's start with the shell. So the shell then is the shell of pilgrimage. It was called taking the cockle if you decided to go off and become a pilgrim. And you didn't always have a choice. You were often punished in a court of law. Instead of going to prison, you went on a pilgrimage. And this shell identified the pilgrim. It was also useful. You could drink water out of it, but most of all, it kept you safe on the way. Pilgrims had certain protections. And this particular shell is a 12th century scallop, actually in Santiago's museum. So it's a symbol of the pilgrim and the journey. And the pilgrimage was very, very well known, of course, all the way through this period. The scallop shell became the symbol of James the Great, and who may have been the brother of Christ, and of the pilgrimage of Santiago de Compostela in 833, so in the 9th century, and was very, very well known in Caravaggio's time. But of course it wasn't well known at the time of the Supper at Emmaus. Well, obviously not. The Supper at Emmaus happened on the Sunday night after the crucifixion. I was enchanted to find the scallop shell appearing on a coin minted at Eleusis in Greece. And it's very interesting that, because it shows that the shell is a symbol of pilgrimage going way, way back, long before anything to do with St. James or the pilgrimage to Santiago. This is 4th century BC, but the shell is obviously much, much older than that. And it shows the three symbols, the pig and the torch and the shell, symbols of Eleusis. So then we've got the knot. I think the next one is to talk about the knot. You see this white cloth here. That's a knot around there. Why is that there? It's not just there for the sake of the composition. The knot then would represent the knot of Solomon. Solomon, you see it all over medieval graffiti everywhere. It's very common. And it's carved all over the place. Here there are two examples from Suffolk and from Italy. And it's found in churches all over Europe. And it's taken from a pre-Christian Roman mosaic, actually. So it represents the powerful symbol that was engraved on the ring of Solomon and given to him by the archangel. And it gave him power over demons. It may also have given him the wisdom to understand the language of animals. When he wore the ring, he could understand what animals were saying to each other and to him. So it's a beautiful thing, the knot of Solomon. This just to show you an ancient Roman mosaic with the knot in it right there. And there's probably a lot more to the knot if you want to look it up. And you see it, of course, in synagogues. This is at Ostia near Rome. You see it on mosaics, and it's a very common symbol. And then you've got the hand. The hand is reaching out to you, very much to you. The hand is an invitation. The shell is the journey, and the knot is the wisdom of the journey and the protection against evil that you have when you make the journey. Now we go back to the painting again, and let's go to the other side of the painting. On the other side, we've got the innkeeper. The innkeeper is very much of this world. He's just an ordinary man. He's just doing his job. And he's got a white cloth round his arm, which you would expect him to have, a sort of serving cloth or something. It doesn't look out of place, does it? But there is a story behind it. And the story is a very gruesome story. And I hope nobody else gets a rifle and wants to shoot me tomorrow, or today, in fact. It actually reminds us that we're looking at a counter-Reformation painting. It's a counter-Reformation painting. And it alludes to a fairly recent, terrible genocide, a massacre, which was the massacre of the Protestants in 1572. And that was the massacre of St Bartholomew's Eve. And many of you who know your history will know this, that Henri of Navarre went to Paris to marry the King of France's daughter, And he famously said Paris was worth a mass, and converted to Catholicism, leaving all his nobles, who were all from the south of France, they wore black so you could see them, high and dry. The massacre of the Huguenots began on the night of the 23rd and 24th of August, midsummer, 1572, on the feast of St Bartholomew the Apostle, and they started 2 days after an attempted assassination of the leader of the Huguenots. Apparently the king, instigated by his mother, Catherine de' Medici, ordered the killing, which spread throughout Paris, and it went on for several weeks. It wasn't just one night. The massacres spread to the other cities. Modern scholars say, perhaps 30,000 Protestants were killed, and that was the end of Protestantism in France. That was the end of it. Now, this is just a painting giving some idea of the terrible bloodshed that was happening in Paris. Now, there was a sign that would save you from this massacre, and it most famously is portrayed in a Victorian painting by John Everett Millais. This is Millet's famous painting of the Huguenot, which you may have had on your bedroom wall as a child, or your grandmother's bedroom wall. It was actually engraved, you see it all over the place. When the clock of the palace, it's got this writing, when the clock of the palace of justice shall sound upon the great bell, then each good Catholic must bind a strip of white linen round his arm and put a fair white cross in his cap. And that was the order of the Duc de Guise, which unleashed the genocide in Paris. So this painting is telling us that Caravaggio is a good counter-Reformation bloke, and this painting has been painted to support the counter-Reformation. The church fought back very strongly. First of all, the church in the Vatican forbade all mythological paintings in Rome. They just evaporated. And used the arts, which were very powerful, to rebuild the stories. And so there's a lot of excellent counter-Reformation art. But when we look at the Innkeeper, you know, he's just an ordinary bloke. He's just there. But with the light behind him, he doesn't see anything special. He's just every man. He just happens to be there. Another beautiful little still life we find on the left-hand side of the painting right here. I mean, that's wonderful in its own right. And the famous glass jugs that he loved to draw and paint so much, the bread with the cross in it. Again, this of course alludes very simply to the Eucharist, the bread and wine, and also perhaps to the water and wine that flowed from, the water and blood, that flowed from Christ's side. And the bread has a cross. Now there are 3 loaves of bread on the table, which is easy, they're Trinity, and they have the cross. And apparently, even to this day, the housewives of Naples and southern Italy, whenever they make bread, will never break bread if it hasn't got a cross in it. So it's a tradition. The whole thing about this, the bread and the wine, is interesting, because if you go back now to the catacombs, the earliest imagery, you will see that the agape feast, as portrayed in the catacombs, shows bread and fish, and usually 2 fish. You can see it here. This table is called a sigma table because it's like a sigma on its side. It's called a lunate sigma. It's like a Greek sigma, which looks like a moon on its side. So it's a sigma table, and you see here 2 fish and 2 bread, and the same thing down there. It's a bit blurry because it's very old, but it's quite clear that there are fish on those platters. And you don't see bread and wine, and that comes in a little bit later, actually. This little sarcophagus fragment is very good because it shows us the fish and the bread's got a cross in the middle of it. There? Got it. I like this one particularly in the Crypt of Lucina because it shows that the fish is alive. There's something more to it. It's obviously an iconographic piece. You see, at this time, you couldn't show Christ as a man because of the 2nd commandment. Thou shalt have no graven images. And so at this time, in the 1st well, there was nothing in the first 200 years. So we're talking about the 3rd and 4th and 5th century, who could only portray Christ by symbols, and there were types for Christ, of which one was the lamb, one was the good shepherd, and here one was the fish. Now, obviously Carravaggio, who was a young man about town, interested in everything, I am absolutely certain that he would have gone down under the city into the tufa tunnels that riddled the area under Rome, just outside the walls. Something like 60 kilometers of tunnels cut in the tufa. I'm sure he would have gone down there. Now, the point was those catacombs were completely lost for 1,500 years. And they were accidentally rediscovered in 1578, when Caravaggio was only about 7 years old. So he grew up in Rome, and I'm sure that he would have taken his oil lamps with his friends and gone as far as he could go, risking being lost and never coming back again. I like this description of going down. It's actually with St. Jerome. He was the first one to recount how, as a student, he would go on Sundays to visit the tombs of the apostles and the martyrs with his companions. We would enter the galleries dug into the bowels of the earth. Rare lights coming from above attenuated the darkness. A little. We would proceed slowly, one step at a time, completely enveloped in darkness. Can you imagine? And surrounded by millions and millions and millions of ossuaries, millions of bones everywhere. Not ossuaries, bones. I mean, there are many, many people. About 6.5 million people were buried in the catacombs. So Caravaggio probably would have seen, with his candle wobbling in the dark, he would have seen these fish. There's a fish. I don't know why they're shown upright, goodness knows. He would have seen the anchor, which you can see here, right there. And as he went on, he would have seen more and more of these fish. Here's another one. There's a fish. And the anchor, and here we've got the Chi-Rho, which is the symbol of Constantine the Great, Chi-Rho. The chi for the first letter of Christ, and the rho being an R for the second letter, Cra. And he would have seen all these things and obviously learnt about them. There are more and more. They're all over the place. Now, why on earth are we talking about this? I'm talking about a Baroque Roman painting, but you're going to find out in a minute. The fish then was an acrostic for the Greek word ichthys, and I'm sure so many of you are aware of ichthys. Ichthys was an acrostic. In Greek, it was Iousis Christos, Theou, Hios, Soter. Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior. The fish then becomes a symbol of Christ himself. And of course, it had traveled from Babylon. Again, it was already an existing symbol. It had a long history. But it's adopted then as a very important, one of the earliest signs for Christ. If you were in Rome and you wanted to talk to somebody about the way, they didn't call it Christianity, you'd be out here in the gravel, you see, and you'd just kind of be talking to somebody, and you'd swing your foot like that in the gravel and make a sort of arch, and then you'd casually step back without noticing. And if the person stepped forward and made the arc the other way to make the fish, then you knew that it was safe to talk. If it wasn't safe to talk, it was, phew, I mean, you were tied to a post and covered with tar and set alight, or you were thrown to animals, or you don't want to, the persecutions was terrible in Rome. So this fish is a very big symbol. If we go to the painting, can we see the fish? And the answer is yes. If we look carefully enough, we can see it. Who can see it? Yeah, very good, well done. You can see it. Can everybody see it? Okay. Can I point out where you say? Down here, it's in the shadow. It's in the shadow cast by the bowl. Can you see that? But if you look closely, it's not cast by any leaves or any fruit. It is the tail of a fish. It's that. It's ichthys. It's the fish. And by that sign, Caravaggio is saying he knew about the earliest Christians and the followers of the way. There it is. And I was very happy when I discovered, going very close, that there are two tails. Can you see the second tail? which sort of told me that he might have had a Christian mentor. I mean, he was a very, very wild boy, wild man, and I think it's rather wonderful that something touched him, the story of these very early and brave people. Now, it's really about an encounter, isn't it? You know, the story is that these disciples are fleeing Jerusalem on the Sunday because something terrible's happened and the tomb's been found empty and everybody is running away, and they join a stranger who doesn't know what's happened. And as they walk along, they explain what's been going on. And when they get to Emmaus, which is about 12 kilometers away, they have a meal. But as he blesses the food, they recognize him. They recognize him. So it's really about recognition. It's about recognition. That's what the painting's about. But when we look at now the figure of Jesus, I'm very intrigued and I'm confused. He's youthful, he's beardless, has these long curling locks, rather androgynous, and he's wearing scarlet and white. I wanted to remind you about this triptych, which is in the Corto collection, because it's quite interesting. It explains the red. This is called the Silent Altarpiece. It was actually bought by Count Anton Zeilen, and it's now been finally attributed to Robert Campen. And 1420 makes it one of the very earliest Netherlandish altarpieces. You see in the center, the figure of Christ is being laid in the tomb. And he's laid in the tomb in his prayer shawl. And he's a Jewish man. He's being laid into his tomb in a Jewish prayer shawl. You see that? The figures, which are hard to see on the hat here of Nicodemus, are actually Hebrew. Where is he? Up there, if you get close enough. Jesus is shown as very dark with a beard, black beard. He was always shown as blonde or auburn. In other words, he was always shown as strictly Aryan, particularly in the Middle Ages. It's quite unheard of that here we have Robert Campen, so courageous. By the way, everybody, Jesus was Jewish, just in case you don't want to think about that. Well, you know, Mary Magdalene is looking into a black hole here. She's holding her vase of ointment, and she's reaching out over that black towards the foot, which is going to be cold. She is literally facing a vacuum, a terrible void. In the Middle Ages, people were very frightened about the horror vacuo, the fear of the void. That's why medieval artwork is so clustered and crowded. The void was full of angels and demons. But here is Mary Magdalene looking down straight into the void. That's on the day of the entombment, and they don't know that there are angels flying all around them. On the next day, on the Sunday, the resurrection, and we see that Jesus, who's laid in the tomb in white, steps out in red. Right? So that it has to be symbolic when something like that. Of course, the red stands for kingship and authority, but on a more profound level, the red stands for all the sin of the world that has been taken on. And he sort of rises out carrying all the sin that ever was, is, and will be, stepping out. And the first thing he does is raise his hand in blessing over and looks down, and he blesses the people who put him there. So that's a very powerful, small thing. And the leg is very straight, because straightness is aligned to justice. I could talk about this for another hour, but let's just move on. The point is that red and white, they come to... I forgot I had this detail. Now you can see it much better. That the red tends to come when you see Christ in his post-resurrection images. This is a very good one to look at as well. This is from the Eisenheim altarpiece, and very beautifully illustrates the words from Isaiah 63. Who is this with his garments stained crimson? There's the red. Who is this robed in splendor, striding forward in the greatness of his strength? It is I speaking in righteousness, mighty to save. It's a wonderful painting by Grunwald. We go back to Rome and the Counter-Reformation, and we look at a work by the Carravaggio brothers. This is by Annibale Carracci, and it's called Domine Quo Vadis, and you see that this is a post-resurrection painting. Christ with a crown of thorns carries his cross, and he's walking back into Rome. You can see in the background some Roman buildings, And so you are pretty much located on the Appian Way. And this was painted for Cardinal Maria del Monte as well. So it fits in, and obviously Caravaggio would have known this. Incidentally, the Carracci were his enemies. But never mind, we won't talk about that right now. So the painting again is Baroque. It pours out into your space, the arm and the end of the cross. It's a painting of great contrast. Peter is old, Christ is young. Peter is cringing, Christ is surging forward. Peter has his heel against the frame of the painting. And Peter is not looking at the face of Christ. Peter is looking at the wound. Peter is looking across here, like that. Can you see it? So the Appian Way at the time of Peter, if Peter was in Rome, was where people were being crucified in job lots down the Appian Way. And Peter was running away, which you really can't blame him for. He was running away down the Appian Way, and he sees a vision coming towards him. And he says, the officer says, Domine, quo vadis? Lord, where are you going? And Jesus doesn't say, actually, Peter, where are you going? I said, feed my sheep, feed my lambs. Oh, no. He just answers the question. I'm going back to Rome to be crucified again with my people. Well, that completely demolished Peter. Peter turns around, goes back to Rome, is captured and crucified upside down. But don't worry about it, because that probably isn't quite the story. But that is the legend of Peter. So you see the white and the red. The red is for the what I've explained, the repentance for the sin of the world, and the white is a color of faith, as I explained yesterday, and of the presence of the Holy Spirit. But more than that, he's very androgynous, and he's wearing this red, and he's got the long curly hair. And this image of repentance fuses with another one, right? This person, this painting is also by Caravaggio. This is Caravaggio as well. And it was lost for centuries, but there were at least 8 copies floating around, so people knew the original existed somewhere. And it's been found very recently. It was found in 2014, I think. So this is a painting of, it's a painting that saddles Mary Magdalene with this whole concept of sin and repentance. Christian devotion became defined as the idea of repentance, mainly through the figure of Mary Magdalene, that the sins were deemed to be sexual and the sinner deemed to be female, which legitimized, I think, an all-male hierarchy of power. Caravaggio's original Mary Magdalene has just been discovered quite recently, and there were many fakes. One is a fake. Which one is the fake? This is the fake. Well, I was going to let you decide. Do you want to know which one do you think is a fake, left or right? Sorry? You say that's the fake, and that's the real one. This is the real one. Sorry, that's the real one, yes? And that's the fake. Well, you're complete. Yeah, that is the real one, and that's the fake. Interesting. So going back to this idea of the red, this is Mary Magdalene in Ecstasy when she was living in the south of France. So back to the painting then, you're beginning to see what the whole story is. You can also see that the imagery in the center of the painting alludes to the New Testament, and the imagery on the outside of the painting, this alluding probably to the Ark, alludes to the Old Testament. But now, why does Caravaggio have a black halo? To me, that just does look like a halo, and it looks like a black halo. And I have battled with this, and I'm not really happy with what I've found. But anyway, I'll share anyway. I'll share. Caravaggio has positioned Jesus deliberately so the shadow of the innkeeper